Rarely in history have women played a more delectably mysterious role than they did throughout the 600 years of the Ottoman Empire, which included modern-day Turkey and regions from the Balkans to Syria. Glories of the old days are often talked about, and many people think that times were good back when wars were fought with honor using sword and shield and people still cared about integrity. But looking back, people refused to accept the state of repair society in general was. During the Harem era, women, even girls as young as 7 years old, were kept in a hidden setting where the Sultan and his court could control, educate, and principally pleasure them. The women were, of course, not allowed to leave the harem, because they were considered to be the Sultan's property and only he and his court could see them. But as servants or as slaves? These women represented the wealth, power, and sexual prowess of the caliphate and were either given as gifts or claimed as war loot. Daily living in an Ottoman harem was like being suspended in a scenario from Arabian Nights, filled with sensuous pleasures and boundless rules, expectations, and restrictions. The harem, which derives from the Arabic word harem, which means sacred or prohibited, was a fabled patriarchy that sought to capture the essence of woman, exploit her in all her splendor, and use her only for its own felicity. A seriously male-dominated society developed in the Ottoman Empire. Turkish nomads were driven from their villages in the 8th and 9th century, and when the Mongols arrived, they finally embraced Islam. The establishment of the Ottoman Empire in 1299 CE brought about a number of changes to the area, including taxation, social changes, and extensive religious indoctrination. It also spawned a phenomenon known as the imperial harem, which housed all the wives, maids, female relatives, and concubines of the sultans between 1299 and 1923 CE. Sultans came and departed as the empire's domain grew, Byzantine Empire economic and social structures were inherited, and Islam emerged as the dominant legal system. The harem was beautiful. The harem's surrounds were breathtakingly beautiful. The women might take a dip in the pool or gaze at the garden in the big pavilion at the heart of the harem dweller's domain. It was a place where reflection and repose were normal. It was gloriously calm and tranquil. The courtyard provided the ladies with a much-needed break from the confinement's interior and served as a place where they could meet to read, worship, or simply tell stories. Private chambers for the Sultan and more than 400 rooms for sleeping, entertaining, and living were contained within their gilded prison. Women, such as the mother, daughters, female relations, and servant girls of the Sultan. Naturally, the eunuchs were continuously keeping an eye out for any improper behavior in the background. The Sultan's sons likewise spent their early years in the harem until they turned roughly 12 years old, at which point they were allowed to dress as courtesans in the palace. Harem women were isolated and kept secret from the outside world. The center of the magnificent court housed the entrance to a harem. The women who occupied these spotless rooms rarely ventured outside of the court, but at least they were in absolutely stunning surroundings. The outside world was placed in an ethereal world of green and blue tiled chambers that were framed in gold and adorned with plush furniture. Only the occasional glimpse of the Sea of Marmara provided a peek of the outside world. The harem's women were observed by eunuchs, some of whom had the potential to rise to positions of prominence within the court. Senior officials thoroughly examined them before allowing anyone to see them to make sure there was nothing fishy going on at either end. Men were also not allowed to observe the harem of another man. However, the eunuch was not the one who could wriggle his way into positions of authority. If they were clever and fortunate enough, women who resided in the harem may also acquire significant power, respect, and riches within the imperial court. Some women had freedom, but others didn't. Not all of the ladies in the Sultan's harem were slaves, despite its restrictions. Many of his wives lived there, and they all had the pleasure of being close to all of his concubines. The ladies of the Sultan were, in theory, free, having consented to marriage of their own free will. There was no other option, therefore there was probably some obvious stress over kebabs in the evening. Simply put, the harem's women needed to put aside their differences and enjoy their odd relationships. Contrary to popular belief in the West, not all harem women were expected to have relations with the Sultan. In actuality, they were all given a little education akin to that of a male page and were groomed to be wed off to members of the court, other nobles, or the Ottoman political elite. They might also choose to remain in the harem and cater to the Valide Sultan's desires. While it's true that many of the attractive and intelligent slave girls in the harem had either been taken prisoner in battle, or discovered via other methods, they quickly assimilated into the wider system and developed into imperial court ladies who would probably go on to have better futures. Unlike only the Sultan's whores who were available at any time of the day, the relationships, both sexual and otherwise, were substantially more complicated. Despite his dominance, there were regulations that established the various women's stations. But the Sultan naturally got what he wanted most of the time, so if it meant changing the rules for the harem, it probably happened pretty swiftly. Typically, anyone who piqued the Sultan's fancy quickly ended up on his silk sheets. In spite of the fact that some of the women were treated as slaves formally and others weren't, they all shared his desire's shimmering boundaries. Once there was a women's sultanate. Women in the caliphate were not always weak and defenseless despite their low rank. During the 16th and 17th centuries, sometimes known as the Sultanate of Women, figures within the harem were able to significantly influence the Ottoman Empire insofar as males felt it appropriate. This was an odd development, especially given the slave origins of many harem ladies. Granted, many of the sultans of the time were juveniles who were clinging to their mother's control. Despite the male concern for such procedures, they frequently engaged in combat or battle planning, and did not maintain a strong grip on the framework of their political landscape. But this illustrious reign of women came to an end in 1687 with the defeat of Kozum Sultan and Turhan Sultan, two of the most powerful female regents. The Sultan stopped advocating war after that and instead retired to the harem's amenities, where they could distance themselves from the outside world and spend their time in luxurious introspection. Within the harem, there was a complete hierarchy of women. The term odalisk, which was used to describe a large number of women in the harem, comes from the Turkish word odork, which means chambermaid, and only provides a brief taste of what women actually worked there. These ladies, sometimes referred to as iqbals, were the Sultan's mistresses, but they were more than simply simple bed warmers. Odalisks were typically talented in music, dancing, or singing, and they were always attractive in some way. They had received the Sultan's mother, Valide Sultan, as well as the first wife's formal approval. In actuality, receiving an odalisk as a gift from the Sultan was considered an honor for any male visitor. The women below the odalisk, known as gedik, were observed by the royal authorities but were not bedded, unless the Sultan decided to change that, of course. But the majority of the time, these women brought him seductive baklava in the evening. Basic servants who performed the identical tasks beneath the gedik did so with considerably less cleavage. Concubines are a term that might technically apply to the bulk of these lower-class women because it loosely translates to one-night stand. Her destiny depended on how much the Sultan delighted in the said stand. Harems fascinated people in the West and in the Victorian era. The harem's absolute mystery was one of its most alluring features. What happened inside? How did they spend the day? Everyone was really private, so nobody really knew. Any heterosexual male who took stock of the situation would find the inner workings of such a matriarchal, sexualized, and curiously personal realm absolutely titillating, as would many women who just couldn't comprehend the reality of such an existence. The issue had caught the thoughts, and nether regions, of Enlightenment philosophers like Montesquieu, who looked to ancient Ottoman customs as a method to attack the rigidity of French life, leading to a significant increase in European paintings of odalisks in the 18th and 19th centuries. All else seemed a waste of time and unnecessary in comparison to it. As a result, there are no reliable sources on the reality of harem life. But the art world is full of imaginative interpretations that attempt to shed light on the fiction. As a result, the majority of visual representations of harem women and their experiences come from the West.